Most of you know that last week I made the announcement that we would have Dr. Heather Lynn with us talking about her new book. And the new book's called From Eden to Armageddon. Excuse me, I'm going to start again. Whoa. Last week I mentioned that I was going to be talking about the Anunnaki, and I have with me this week Dr. Heather Lynn and a new book that she's written called From Eden to Armageddon, the Anunnaki Connection, Sumerian Gods, Alien DNA, and the Fate of Humanity. Now, I couldn't put this book down. I really enjoyed it. Of course, most of you know that I was familiar with and featured Zecharia Sitchin in many of my programs here in San Francisco. And he was in conferences around the world. And of course, you should know, or you do know, that he wrote extensively about the Anunnaki. But hey, Heather, this was fun to read. And this is the book After Evil Archaeology. What was your motivation? I mean, you do write that you do keep an eye on the latest understanding, the latest, I guess you could call it transcriptions or decipherments of the Sumerian cuneiforms, the terracotta tablets. But what made you write a whole book? Because that's a lot.
That is. It was a lot, and I consider it unfinished because I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. But I think one of the reasons I tackled it in this work was because there is so much information out there on the Anunnaki, and one of these controversial topics that even within sort of a fringe discussion, you have people on one side, the other, and it gets very heated. And you're starting to see these sort of cults of personality, or, you know, like, for instance, you mentioned Zecharia Sitchin. Zecharia Sitchin really is associated with this topic. And as a result, so many people look at this topic through that lens only. So whether or not the Anunnaki are real versus are they space people, or was Sitchin right or was Sitchin wrong? And unfortunately, I feel that has narrowed the whole scope of the topic, which is a really broad question of who were the Sumerians and who were the Anunnaki and what do we know and what can we still learn from these tablets that are actively being translated right now. And so I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about the translations, the nature of translating tablets, period. The idea is that, so few people can translate them, that they're not very accessible, or that only Sitchin, had the ability to translate these, and therefore the knowledge is, started and ended with him. And these are just fallacies. And I thought it was important to, rather than go attacking people, as is usually done, I thought instead I would like to see if I could find some of the commonalities and connect some of the dots to see, where any overlap could be, and to also bring in some overlap from the mainstream academia along with the fringe, or, just sort of make a more holistic picture of this topic and just see where it would lead.
You make a good point in the book of telling the reader that these transcriptions, these decipherments are available in various documents or published forms. And I was wondering if this was kind of a reason to consider writing about the Anunnaki, because perhaps as you were reading something, you thought, well, wait a minute, this is something that Sitchin talks about, and he didn't get it right. Or he got it right, but he didn't get the transcription right or something.
That was part of it. Part of it was just the idea that there are these tablets that are very hard to decipher, and they're inaccessible, and while to some degree some of them can be difficult to access, and some of them indeed have not been translated, a lot of the translations are available to the general public online, and that does make it more interesting to see if you can maybe validate some of Sitchin's findings, or anybody's for that matter. And again, it's taking it with a grain of salt at the same time, because translation is different than interpretation, and that's something that I try to point out in the book as well, which is that there are people who have translated the text who have the ability to understand The dictionaries are available for free online. The texts themselves, the main body of work, the different epics and proverbs, they're available for, just you can view them, download them, search them, a whole host of things just by Googling and finding, some of the main websites, the University of Oxford, and you have University of Pennsylvania, you have a couple others too, but those are the two, really good ones. They're a little clunky and out of date, but I mean, considering they're a large database, it's pretty impressive and again, easily accessible. And so, just toying around with that a little bit and using just a general understanding of culture and mythology and comparative mythology, I thought it would be interesting to tackle not just the interpretation, but the translation to a certain extent. But again, I do think that so many people have already done this and either supported some of Sitchin's translations or have, called them out and said they weren't quite accurate. And so, but what does that do? Then where does that leave us? So we have these, maybe mistranslations or what have you. But then again, there's that interpretation. How do we go from this word meaning that word to an entire mythos? Because these are not direct translation. Anybody that speaks a foreign language or a second language understands that when you translate, it's not just a word for word sort of replacement. There's nuance, there's meaning, there's a complete understanding. Sometimes there's words that cannot be translated word for word. I mean, often that's the case. And what does that mean? Well, that's hard to explain. It doesn't actually translate well, but we kind of know what it means. For that example, that's, where I started looking like, well, what about the interpretation? Because you have Sitchin's work who, he spent so much time and so much effort doing a lot of the heavy lifting. He did do a lot of work. And that's something that, I do point out in the book, which is this is not a book to try to actively debunk Sitchin. That would be a boring book. That would be like every other debunking style book. And that's just, I'm not interested in doing that because that doesn't give you original information. That just, is rehashing and trying to capitalize off of a subject matter. And that's just not what I do. But in an effort to understand Sitchin, I had to look at these things and motivations and sort of understand where he was coming from, which was a point of bias that he had done all of this research and was very, I think, in my opinion, now I hadn't met with him personally, and so this is just from my perspective looking back on his research, that he did a lot of work and as a result was very invested in it, emotionally invested, very passionate about his work, and he didn't want to, go back over all of that work and maybe update it if necessary, especially after making an entire interpretation, entire epic out of this. And so, and I don't fault him for that. I think that what he did was really important and it got people thinking. It still has people thinking. However, if you just end it there, then it's like in a state of suspended animation. Time has gone on. We have decades and decades of research after where his research stopped. And so you have to be willing to go back and look at your mistakes or look at your, whatever it may be, and just update that. And so, that's where I'm at with Sitchin specifically and many other authors. So
let's talk about one of the things that he was very big on, and he believed, and he wrote that the Anunnaki, a alien race, created some form of Homo sapiens sapien, or something close. Does he prove that? Does he show that through the tablets, or does that make sense to you that that's what happened?
Yes, but with an asterisk. So it really goes back to the way that it's interpreted rather than translated. I do believe that the texts make it clear that the Anunnaki created man. However, there's a lot of ways to interpret creation. What does it mean to create, and what does it mean to create a man? In Sitchin's view, it's almost just this literal creation. There was nothing, and then there's something. So, and it's very biblical. So Adam is made out of clay and just formed into a person or something to that matter. Then you have this intrinsic sort of environmental bias that a lot of authors around that time had, which is being influenced by 1960s technology. And so you have maybe a science fiction approach to it. So you can easily see how you go from blending a religious view with a science fiction view and have some sort of, picture of these Anunnaki beings creating man using science and technology, and in a way you kind of picture them in lab coats with beakers and they're mixing up our DNA. But there's not enough, those are interpretations and I guess different takes on something that is not clear from any of the data. But
Okay.
what does seem to be the case is that the idea that the Anunnaki created man. So I go into this in the book a little more and discuss the idea of creating man. In just to wrap it up, a quick, way to explain it, I think is better to say that man was different. The man that the Anunnaki created was civilized man. So I think it's more of a civilizing approach as opposed to creating a biological entity out of nothing or even tampering with the DNA. And now, so it kind of goes back to the whole idea to begin with. What could a possible interpretation for the Anunnaki actually be? And this is where, after the research I've looked at, both archaeological, geological, climatological, historical, and literary records, I come out of the book sort of under the impression that there was indeed a group of advanced living beings who settled in a mountain valley in the Near East around 8200 BCE, and they brought with them extraordinary technologies that had not been seen before by the sedentary late epi-Paleolithic hunter-gatherer groups that were already residing there. And so it's more of a discussion, in my view, that there was an advanced civilization that by what I believe to be a meteor, but a climatological disaster, a near extinction event. And as a result, they sent their best and brightest minds to various parts of the world, sort of like a breakaway civilization. And they ended up resettling. And again, this is very generalized, and I go into detail in the book about why I believe this, what the translations are. But if you follow along this sort of line of thinking, you can sort of see how the idea of them creating man could come about if you think of it in terms of these advanced beings came and technologies and created the notion of a civilized, educated, what we would look at as a modern human now, even though biologically they were both modern Homo sapiens sapiens.
You basically answered my next question, which was that in your interpretation of the Anunnaki, they were an advanced human Earth-based group. But I guess the thing I wanted to ask you is, would this fall within the mythos of Atlantis, of Mu, of an advanced Earth-based civilization that was perhaps 100,000 years old, that had, through their own research and development, come to a very, very high standard of living and science, and through and following this meteor hit that basically destroyed so much of the Earth, they were the survivors, and these are what the Sumerians encountered very early, pre-Sumerian, I guess, these paleo hunters and gatherers, and this is what basically the story that you come up with. So this is you feel comfortable with that?
Exactly. I think you really said that better than I could. It's exactly what I'm looking at and seeing from the information. So when you look at some of the older texts, many of your listeners are, I'm sure, familiar with the fact that the Bible, particularly the story of Noah, really were sourced from the Sumerian tablets. It was a Sumerian myth and probably oral tradition as well. And so when you look at those specifically, and you don't look at it through a biblical lens or like Judeo-Christian or any of, in this a more ancient story, it specifically says in the text that he took not his family members and this is where it gets, a little dicey, and some people don't like this, but I'm just the messenger. So the text actually says that it does not necessarily bring his blood family, nor does it bring one or two of each animal and this sort of thing, but it says that this Noah figure brings the learned people, the priest class, one of each, and also with them the animals of the steppe. And in that context, it's very important to differentiate from just animals to the animals of the steppe where these people were, because the animals that they brought with them would have been then those that would have been the domesticated animals they could have used for supplies. And so what you're really looking at in the Noah story is, a group of these priest class, these very, the type of people you'd want to go make a new civilization, the ones who understood science and agriculture and these sorts of things. And they brought with them enough of their animals to get them by as they had to become nomadic and travel. And, they were displaced. And the reason they knew about this in advance was because they were brilliant astronomers and they understood how things were looking. And so, and of course, this morphs for, hundreds and thousands of years into the Noah's Ark, which turns into something different. But which is why I believe that some of these subjects are so controversial and very divisive potentially as well.
Right. We got the religious side of it too. You define these early people as the black-headed people, or the Adam, or the red people. Are these Neanderthals, or what is the level of hominin we're talking about that the Anunnaki encountered?
That's a very good question. I think that the primitive people at the time there were Homo sapiens sapiens. And they were referred to in the text as the black-headed people. And so I think that's important, because then that would imply, it would be logical to surmise that those that describe them as such did not have black hair themselves. Otherwise, you wouldn't differentiate between those characteristics. So you have a different looking person coming down, to people with darker hair. They also call them the Adama, which meant the red people. And what I found to be interesting here is, in this particular region of Mesopotamia, they used this ochre, this really specific ochre that was a very red color. And I found the archaeological evidence to suggest that they may have painted themselves, like many other cultures and civilizations, with this ochre in both a decorative and probably a protective way to protect themselves from the sun. If this were the case, and again, there is archaeological evidence that I cite in the book for this, but it's also speculation. It's more of a qualitative thing here on my part to suggest this. But I do go there and I say it would be, I think, possible for these people to come to Mesopotamia, find Homo sapiens sapiens who had black hair, and they had painted themselves or adorned themselves in the color red, leading us to refer to them as the black-headed people, or the red people. And that's important because the red people, the word Adama is where we get the word Adam. The Adama, or the red people, is still understood in Hebrew. I think Sitchin, even as Hebrew, someone who studied Hebrew, he understood that that's what it meant as well. However, the interpretation generally for that is that it refers to God creating Adam out of clay from the earth and putting him together like a little statue.
Right.
That's an idea that goes through Abrahamic religions, generally speaking. So I sort of reject that idea and take it to mean something that could be a little more literal. Why not believe the ancients when they themselves say, we found the red people? I would tend to want to go with that original source material rather than a theological, interpretation down the way. And so that's why I dug a little deeper, no pun intended, to reinterpret or understand a little bit of what Adama meant. But I do believe they were just generally Homo sapiens sapien. But you bring up an interesting point about Neanderthal, because I might have touched on it here, but it's something that I have been looking into just on the side a little more, which is the idea of the Epic of Gilgamesh and what Enkidu was. And I've been leaning toward the possibility that Enkidu in that story may have been Neanderthal or a different subspecies. And so maybe they coincided, or at least ran into each other at some point, or at least had oral tradition and a genetic memory, or an oral traditional memory of that, or something to that effect. That's a very interesting question, and I wouldn't rule it out completely.
Interesting. You say in the book that this hybridization, the Anunnaki working with these black-headed people, was around 200,000 years ago. And that, and you do a great job of corresponding to the dating of the skeletal remains that we've been able to find. Does that actually show the inception date of these people, or is that kind of still in question as to when the offspring of the Anunnaki began to appear?
I think it's still in question, and the reason I think that is because you've had so much of a mix now. We've had the oral tradition that then becomes a written tradition, and so it looks to be, so you can date something to this date because we may have a tablet for it, but how old is that, actual account? It could be far older. So there's that in question. And also, you have just the general idea that time is different. We have Julian calendars, Gregorian calendars, and so on. There's a lot of time differences in how things are communicated, and so it's difficult to expect the literary accounts to be very accurate. So it's to look at the dating of the artifacts and to understand it in that context is more reliable. But that's also, I think, what adds to some of the confusion in the question, which is, when did this happen? And so I think another component to that is this clash of cultures, literally, where you have the hunter-gatherer types, and then you have other people that maybe came from that, shall we say, civilization X, and they came in. They have different concepts of time, different understanding of how to calculate time, also a different level of history that they've kept themselves. So when you mix those two, I mean, we're talking a potential for, oral histories that go back 100,000 years. I mean, how do we even know? These are very large-scale speculative questions that are probably impossible to truly answer.
Yeah, we don't have documents that go that far back. You talk a great deal about the workforce that the Anunnaki created, which are these hybrids. Sitchin tells us that they were used to dig gold, the gold being shipped back to Nibiru to help the atmosphere. But what do you think they actually were used for? Just general agriculture and hard labor, or what would you say that their creation was directed towards?
I think at first, general hard labor. I mean, even as Sitchin discussed, the mining efforts and this sort of thing, and I don't discount that at all, because mining is a very important part of just, general hard labor, finding resources, and, but a lot of the texts really do discuss what the Sumerians are really, really noted for in just mainstream ideas and even otherwise, is their ability to control water. They're very much associated with water, and so irrigation was huge. Just the building of canals and different ways to divert water. So I believe that it would have started with something like that. So, but it could be everything. They're mining for the important resources, for agriculture. I think just a general workforce. I understand the appeal in saying gold, because all these cultures seems to have a unifying love of gold, and it's a very romantic idea. But when you really look in there, it seems to be that they were far more interested in agriculture, in my assessment, which is no small thing when you consider how important that was. And so one of the things that is specifically noted is that they were to worship the Anunnaki. And in the Hebrew, worship means to work for. So they quite literally work for the Anunnaki in way of worship. One of the ways they were to worship the Anunnaki is a way that we understand worship in Abrahamic or older, or Afro-Asiatic religions or, belief sets, as sacrifice, animal sacrifice. So they also had animal sacrifice as a way to worship. Well, when you really consider what the sacrificing of an animal was, it was literally a cookout. It wasn't that you would take the animal and burn it away. It was that animal, it would be food. It wouldn't go to waste. And when you look at some of the accounts I list in the book, and you start seeing that there were even recipes that the Anunnaki had. They expected the Adama, or the hybrids even, to cook for them. And it really did require what we would consider worshiping with burnt offering. And so you'd have to get goat and specific sorts of meat and you would burn it and do this sort of thing. So if you really look at it, what they were doing was the agricultural work, the cooking, most of the labor, and they were told to do this for the Anunnaki. So there is sort of a stratification of classes.
Wow. I don't know if you can answer this next
Mm-hmm.
question or not, but do we, I don't know. I mean, do we have any understanding of these early hominins, these Anunnaki, and is there DNA in our DNA, in our genes? I mean, do we have any sense of an ancient link to these advanced humans in any way, or is it just too old, too long ago, or there's too much mixed up in our cellular DNA that we can't find it?
Well, that's a difficult question for a lot of reasons.
That's why you're like, Cliff, I don't want to answer that because I don't know.
It's difficult because, as you said, it's sort of like to get a good, answer for that, but also it can kind of cause some people nowadays in our politically, sensitive time that we're living in to be a little angry because, well, let me explain. There are archaeological reports that suggest that blue-eyed genes originated near the Black Sea due to a genetic mutation that occurred between 6 and 10,000 years ago. So, and why that's important is if you pay attention to the earliest depictions of the Anunnaki, the statues, the ones that we can look at that were not necessarily etched, but that were, multidimensional, three-dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't say multidimensional, it's inaccurate, and it could also be taken to be so different. But three-dimensional looks, they were depicted as having big blue eyes. They use lapis lazuli a lot to show these big blue eyes. Right. In the region that's now Iraq, people with blue eyes are definitely found. It's not a common trait, but they're there. But since they weren't a common feature then, blue eyes became a symbol of evil. And the ancients believed that people with blue eyes would just curse you. That's where we get the idea of evil eye. And so to protect themselves, the Assyrians later, the Sumerians and later the Assyrians, they carried with them amulets made of a blue-hued material like either lapis lazuli or turquoise. And they did this to protect themselves from the evil eye that would be the blue eye. And so interestingly, when you look at this notion of the blue eyes, and again, most of the people, the black-headed ones, were known to have brown eyes. But according to Professor Hans Eyberg from the University of Copenhagen, all people originally had brown eyes. The mutation occurred in one individual that affected a gene called OCA2 that essentially turned off the ability to produce brown eyes. And so in a cross-section of specimens, he and his team examined this mutation was seen in exactly the same spot in the DNA, indicating that all blue-eyed individuals are linked to the same ancestor. And the geneticists who study this believe that blue eyes originated from the Near East area or northwest in part of the Black Sea region, where the great agricultural migration to the northern part of Europe took place in the Neolithic period about 10,000 years ago, maybe in a northern part of Afghanistan, and that's what they believe. And so it only takes one genetic mutation to make that difference. And so this idea that, the Anunnaki genetically engineered early humans, and in a way, you could almost agree with these things because it wasn't done with beakers. It was done with actual just old-fashioned techniques like assimilation, people, getting together and having babies and just assimilating into culture. But, if you look at it, it's there could definitely be that. Now, you could see why it causes sometimes in these, uncertain times, as everyone's saying now, that can be controversial because it's that idea that anyone with blue eyes then may have been more advanced and coming down to the, and this is, so it's a tricky subject because it's something that, could be taken out of context. But if you just look at the science of it, there is this genetic component. And so it is interesting to think. Now, again, that's all speculative, clearly, but there is genetic, evidence for something like that to be the case.
I asked that because my interest goes to the Denisovans, which are, we've only just begun to figure these guys out. We've got a pinky bone, we have a massive molar, that looks like it's from a giant. And there's some authors out there that speculate that these were a giant race, 8 feet tall, huge, but very, very intelligent. We've seen some of their jewelry. Where do they fit in this question? You don't really describe them, but I'd like to just ask you where they might fit in, or perhaps they're an anomaly in a way.
Well, they could be an anomaly, but this notion of them being very large, I think that's something to consider, because one of the more popular claims, the more popular claims of the Anunnaki is that they were giants.
Right.
You know, some of these theories are due in part to images like the tablet of Shamash, which figures this seated god Shamash, which is offering a rod and a ring, which is a symbol to Hammurabi, who is standing. And so when you see that, it looks pretty amazing that Hammurabi, who is very important himself, is still small compared to this god who is sitting. And so if you take it quite literally, it would appear to be that this god is a giant. You know, but then again, it doesn't help that there are references in, say, biblical texts that go on to say there were giants in the earth in those days, and they attribute that to the intermingling of these Anunnaki and humans, and that they had these giant offspring. But whether or not they were giants, it's, you know, I think I sort of touch on it in the book and discuss that a lot of the pictures that you see online are deeply photoshopped, the ones where they're just huge giants. So I would say that just in the sense that what Earth could bear, what our gravitation, our gravity could bear, we wouldn't be more than 10 foot tall, if that. So the idea of them being that large, of those perhaps being related to the Anunnaki, I think it could be. I mean, I don't really have a great deal of information to,
It's
say
tough because we have so little. We have so little data.
Little.
Yeah. It's a really
but I would
challenge.
think I wouldn't be surprised though if when we get more data that we find that there's definitely a connection, that they cohabitated or somehow knew of each other, or even traded for all we know. And that's something interesting because, there are still mainstream archaeologists that deny that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens sapiens had any sort of, intermixing or anything like that, which is just ludicrous because there's DNA evidence of that. But there's still denial. And so that's a pretty new idea. So I can only imagine what we'll find later when more data about that comes out.
We need to get a full skeleton. That's what I keep saying. Let's get a skeleton.
I know. Well, maybe we already have them too.
So somebody's hiding.
Perhaps.
Yeah. You talk a great deal about the advanced astronomy that Sumerians inherited. Would you say that these Anunnaki, obviously they were the point of reference for it, but do you think that they may have been space explorers too? Because I have a real problem with archaeoastronomy, where archaeologists say that they stood on their platforms and they could see the details of Venus. I mean, this is a problem I have with the Mayan interpretation, archaeoastronomy, where they were able to determine great detail from just looking with the naked eye. What do you think about that? What do you think about possibly being space explorers, or really, really advanced, perhaps had really powerful telescopes and that kind of equipment?
I think they probably had very powerful telescopes and a whole sort of equipment that we just don't have anymore because it's just lost to time and that sort of thing. Whether they could look at these things with their naked eye, I mean, I think to some extent, as anybody could, but, I think they definitely had tools to aid with their knowledge. They certainly had amazing understanding of mathematics, and more so we're learning every day how much they actually knew, which is just astounding. So I think they did have a huge scientific ability. The idea if whether or not they could have traveled, that's tricky, because if you look at, say, 10,000 years ago, roughly that, I just personally can't really get on board with that. Now, if you think about it even further back, perhaps the people who brought the technology, brought the understanding, the antediluvian sages, if you will, to those people that came and resettled Mesopotamia, a much further back civilization, I think that could be possible. And I think that if that did happen and they had that knowledge that they acquired from that, they passed it down as sacred knowledge in what is referred to in the text as the sacred knowledge of Enki. And there is a lot of talk about this, of these great sages that came before the ones who came to Mesopotamia, having all of this knowledge. They attribute their scientific understanding to these predecessors who they actually refer to as semi-biological beings. And so in a lot of ways, it's like a more, and from my interpretation, it seems to be more of a shamanic experience that these Anunnaki that, you know, we come to regard as the prototypes for the 12 Olympians and all these different gods, but these Anunnaki were influenced by their beliefs in an off-world sort of sage that they would contact in shamanic ways via hallucinogenic, you know, means, whether it was meditation or, you know, however. So they claim that that's where they got their knowledge. So, you know, but there's not a lot out there on that. There's just that little bit about that.
Is it because we don't have we haven't gone through enough of the tablets to see if there's any history like that? Because I mean, you write in great detail about the volumes, the rooms, the cellars filled with these tablets that just have not been touched. Is there any kind of trail? Is there trails that even give hints?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just that they still have so many to interpret. When we're talking tablets, and it's really important to consider, you'll see a picture that's on the internet a lot of Zecharia Sitchin holding a great big Sumerian cylinder seal. Right. Well, that picture that's really ubiquitous has been blown up. That actual cylinder seal is a replica, and it's been enhanced so that you can see the detail. When we speak of these tablets, and of course we hear tablet, and it's easy to conjure up the idea of Moses in the movie The Ten Commandments holding these large tablets. But when you say tablets or cylinder seals, they're very small and they can fit in the palm of your hand. So there are thousands and thousands of bags, literal just huge canvas bags of these tablets, whether they're broken or, you know, fully intact. There are so many, and they're still being excavated. So yes, it's definitely a supply demand issue where they just don't have enough people to do it. And now, whether or not it's how many people can do it isn't always the question either. It's where's the funding? Who's going to pay to have it done? Also, how long does it take? They are working on methods to use AI to do these sorts of things, which, you know, I mean, that's its own can of worms. But yeah, there are tablets that are, you know, just sitting and waiting to be, you know, translated. Some people have been able to.
They call it machine intelligence, where the machine learns, and then that might be something to think about. How do you feel about that?
Yes, I think that well, I think it still would need a human touch. I think it should have some human oversight because, you know, with algorithms, and I think the technology could do it. Yes. I think that's not a question of whether or not it could be done. I just think, however, you know, with anybody who's interested in coding and algorithms, things can get very buggy very fast, and it still takes a level of human input. And so then you have to question, well, you know, that's a lot of power to give, you know, one person or a handful of people or a team or what have you. I think it's probably better and safer and more reliable to have that, you know, checks and balances. And in any kind of research, that's something that you want to do. If you're doing what's called coding for, you know, in any sort of experiment, you would do the experiment, you get the data, and then you would generally assign teams to this sort of thing, and they would do member checking and validation, and it's something that sort of like peer review too. You have a lot of people that are involved, and that's it's a very good thing. It helps the information be better, arguably. But then if you use computers, well, it does, in my opinion, it introduces a bit of a lack of reliability and oversight primarily. So I think that it
Yeah.
could be useful as long as it was also utilized by other human beings. I think there's no substitution yet for the human touch.
We have a few years to go before we can trust AI 100% to decipher. I think it would make a lot of people nervous.
You're right, especially if
New
it's
division of machine learning.
yeah.
Machine learning. Hey,
Yeah.
you mentioned seals. I'd like you to talk about this cylindrical seal VA243, which is thought to describe the planets in the solar system. What did you discover on that? That's been a big question for a lot of people. Sitchin says it has all the planets in our solar system, but does it?
Yeah, this is the big one here, and this is the one that if you even just, I believe that's the one that he holds in the photo
Exactly.
that's very popular on the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so this one, it's kind of the smoking gun. It's the most important one if you are to believe that the claim, which is that the Sumerians knew of the exact locations of the celestial objects in the sky. It's sort of this idea that they knew the exact placement of what they claim to be Nibiru, and it's a very important piece. Well, I look at it in the book. I didn't try to debunk it. That wasn't my goal. I just wanted to look at it with fresh eyes. I didn't try to look at other people's explanations, and I started to. It really comes down to the consistencies in celestial depictions in Sumerian art generally. In Sumerian art, suns have 6 or 8 points. Stars are totally separate from this. They're not associated with the sun at all, and they're depicted as just these little dots. And you can see this throughout a lot of the Sumerian portrayals of the Pleiadian star system, which they also associated with these 7 sages, these other entities that were sort of the advisors of the Anunnaki. And so you see this everywhere, the little dots. A dot will be placed in front of a figure to denote godhood. And so it's a very important, thing to consider. So with this in mind, you can see that this grouping of dots would represent a specific constellation rather than a planetary system. And that's my, kind of view on that. And so using that view, I went to look at the Sumerian constellations that had 11 stars recorded in the Babylonian star catalog, which exists. I mean, there's the Babylonian star catalog had all of these. You can look it up online, and it's available for anybody to read. But in this particular seal, it shows 11 stars, in my view, not necessarily planets. So I'm looking at these as stars, and given their grouping, I believe them to be a constellation. When I looked, what I found was the only real contender for that would be the constellation Centaurus, or what the Babylonians called the Bison Man. Scholars believe the seal is dedicated to agriculture, which, the seated god in this picture is seen giving a plow to a worker. And the seal actually, reads in this particular way. It gives the name, and it says your servant. And it basically, the 11 stars surrounding the star-like image, it doesn't quite make sense to me. But if you consider the Bison Man and the story that's linked to the Bison Man, I think it starts to represent that story in and of itself. And so in the story, the Bison Man is one of Tiamat's offspring who defeated Marduk, and he was to have hung on a beam as part of the story. So he has a chariot, and it inspired terrible, and he was said to have hung his captured wild bulls on the axle, and then hung his captured cows on a piece of the yoke, and he hung a 6-headed wild ram on the dust guard, and he hung a warrior dragon on the seat, and hung the bison on the beam, etc. So it goes on to discuss really these ancient constellations. And so if you look at this, in my view, it is the story tells the Bison Man being hung on the beam, which meant the spoke of a chariot. And if you look at how chariot wheels are depicted in Sumerian art, they have 6 spokes attached to a very large ball in the center, very similar to what is claimed to be the sun in this piece of art. Now, I'm not standing by this and saying, oh, this is exactly what it is. And, it's still pretty, good that this was a more reasonable or logical interpretation of this particular seal. And if you remove the wheel itself and instead imagine that the Bison Man constellation is wrapped around the beam, you get what appears to be the six-spoked image in the sky, surrounded by the 11 stars of the constellation originally known as Bison Man or Centaurus in 243 seals. And so I just think that it could be that this is a constellation-like image depicted that is describing a story that is in Ninurta's return to Nippur. And again, I'm not saying that this is definitive proof and that's it, and I've laid down the gauntlet, but I am saying that I think that this fits more along the line with, the traditional ways that the Sumerians describe their constellations, their mythos, and not rather the, argument that this was a star map, because they did have star maps. And that's what I referred to as the star map in order to sort of, give a loose interpretation of this. This was not their star map.
So that I think Sitchin also used that to kind of justify the Anunnaki's planet, which you talk a little bit about. And is that planet an actual place? Is that an actual functioning planet, Planet X? That just before he died in 2010, he was saying that the planet was going to come back into our solar system. I mean,
yes.
And then there were some astrologers that said, well, we think we found something. But can you talk a little bit about?
I think there are a lot of
yeah.
Sure. I think there are plenty of exoplanets that could fit the bill for Sitchin's Nibiru. However, there's a difference between Sitchin's Nibiru and the Sumerians' Nibiru. And that's, I think, the important thing to consider.
Okay.
So Nibiru in the Sumerian text is, or any of the Mesopotamian tablets, it's very rarely referenced. It's very fragmentary. And it's often related to names of the god Marduk. And so that would give rise to very different interpretations at that point. So in looking into this and trying to really, I guess, show my own bias and wanting to believe, I didn't stop there. I tried my hardest to find any evidence. And according to the hypothesis of Sitchin's, which is that Nibiru is translated as a crossing point, which, divides not the horizon, but the celestial equator, Tiamat, etc. I really started looking into this, and I just couldn't find anything to suggest that it was indeed a planet. But again, I was looking and trying to find, what does this crossing over mean? And in the Sumerian text, the word Nibiru is also in an older form spelled, instead of the common Nibiru, it's spelled Neberu. And that's superscripted with the cuneiform sign for God, meaning that if anything, Nibiru was a god rather than a planet. And so, looking at that again, the Akkadian spelling there means to cross over indeed. And so sometimes it's Nibiri, meaning a ferryman, as if you would need to pay one, crossing over, which is a very, common myth. And so when you break the word apart, you can read the original spelling for Nibiru as separate parts to be the N-E-B-E-R-U, or sometimes R-I. And according to that older translation, and this is just toying around with it on my part. So if you look at that, breaking it apart, the N-E meant brazier, or a container for hot coals. The N-E could then also mean strength or force, according to the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary. B-E meant to diminish or receive. And then finally, the R-I would mean to cast or throw down. And so if you then look at it in that context, you could easily interpret Nibiru as meaning a forceful hot brazier diminishing as it's being thrown down. And then if you consider the association made to both stars and deities, then it's reasonable, I think, to see Nibiru as not a planet but a comet. So that's kind of where I am with
that's a big
Nibiru
departure
question.
from a planet,
a rogue planet.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Now, one of the real fun aspects of this book that you wrote is your interpretation of the connection with off-world civilizations or beings and the Earth-based Anunnaki, who you describe as pre-diluvian culture, and the Sumerians who come along much later. You describe a form of communication with these off-world beings as the basis for the advancement, not only of the Anunnaki, but of the Sumerians. And you refer to them as the seven sages or sages. Who are these beings, and where do they come from? Is there a planetary body they come from?
Yeah, that was probably the strangest component of my research, is that, the term Anunnaki, it's sort of all encompassing. You have the few that people are aware of. There's three specific ones that kind of make up a holy trinity. Mm-hmm. There are 12 that are similar to the gods of Olympia, but you actually have hundreds more. And then on top of that, you have these sages. And then eventually in some of the kings lists, the earlier kings lists, you start to see the kings themselves being listed with a sage, that this king was advised by this sage, and it was an Anunnaki. And then as time went on, you see that rather than have that sage associated with the king then is an Anunnaki. And so it's my personal understanding that one of the reasons it gets so confusing is the term Anunnaki is overextended, and that in a lot of ways it's like the word Lord that we use today. So you have Lord Jesus, Lord Shiva, the landlord, the Lord of the Manor, etc. It becomes not just a formal theocratic sort of divine title, but it can also be just a position or a status. And so knowing that and understanding that aspect, you have then these seven sages who are also considered Anunnaki. However, they're very different than the Anunnaki that came to Mesopotamia and encountered the black-headed people who were living there. And these sages were said to be divine beings that dwelled in a different plane of reality. And that's very, very much how the texts indicate. And so whether or not that different plane of reality meant that it was a different planet altogether, they did seem to have an understanding that that was the case. However, they also referred to them as being able to shapeshift, and they also discussed how they lived and emerged from the ocean. And so it's really, not easy to just say alone that, yes, they came from a particular planet, because they didn't really say that as much as they said that it was a different plane of existence, almost a different reality and that sort of thing. And then you have to look at how they interacted with them, what they believed, and how they were able to be in communication with them. According to the text, which I cite and reference in the book, they had direct contact with these, what could be considered extraterrestrial sources that they believed to be sages. These sages, I think personally were the same off-world entities that other civilizations found ways to contact and also receive great technologies. And you see these beings, being referred to in many different cultures. You have the seven sages, or the Apkula, the archons of the Gnostics, the serpent gods of the Far East and Central America, the Titans of the Greeks, and the Snake Brothers of the Hopi, and so on and so forth. And so I think that these are the connected myths that are the underlying truths behind, what they believed. Maybe that was the oral tradition, maybe that was their form of religion, but that's what gets a little wonky in some of these texts, is you have where it departs from this very standard, shift in migration pattern, or, setting up a new settlement or something, to these references to these strange, what they say are semi-biological entities from a different dimension that they are in touch with through special spiritual practices and mystery religion type occult activities. It is sparse. It's not a huge body of work. However, it is very specific. And so that to me is interesting.
When you say semi-biological, that makes me feel like it's like a physical entity of some kind. Is that what your interpretation is?
I really don't see any other way to look at it. If they say semi-biological, it's I've had some people who are maybe into, different ways of looking at these subjects as saying that they were like, the Greys or some sort of alien type thing. You
I
have
hear you.
people who say that so that's one way. Maybe they're AI technology. Maybe they're that advanced that there's some sort of a human. There's so many ways, and it's easy to go off in those directions because there's really nothing to stop you other than your own ideas and sense of reason and sense. But otherwise, there's no definitive way to look at it. It was just that these are semi-biologic in terms that they were physical, they had bodies, they had bodily functions, they had bodily needs. However, they could turn into ghostly type figures or communicate from afar, or that they were shapeshifters, which was very clearly denoted that they would, shift shape. So that's a hard one. I mean, you could look at it if your perspective was based more in a supernatural ghost type realm, you could easily say that they were like spirits or ghosts or however. So I think that lends itself to, why it's so difficult to really nail this down is it's really not clear. But when it is clear, it's strange. And it opens up sort of a Pandora's box of potentials that, needs more research, truly.
Yeah. I was left, and we're concluding our time together here, I was left with the impression that this might be a way that we have our culture advanced is through contact, either subconscious, unconscious, even perhaps the term channeled information comes through somebody and it's actually validated. But as a culture, as a civilization, I'm always wondering how we move to the next level, how we advance. And I'm curious to know your feeling after you wrote this book and understanding the seven sages. Perhaps, a form of panspermia comes through on a cellular level and touches our body and presents more information. What do you say about that?
I say that I was prepared when writing this book to just simply look at the Anunnaki as, its own sort of thing altogether. And I didn't anticipate this whole seven sages component. I didn't anticipate finding anything having to do with that. And so once I found that and started looking into it more, it really has launched me into a new study of, discarnate entities. As you mentioned in the beginning of the show, my previous book was Evil Archaeology, where I discussed demons and those ideas.
Yeah.
And so currently I'm working on a follow-up to that, which is Sacred Archaeology, where I look at the idea of the angels or the different Mesopotamian good spirits. But all of that was, I was encouraged to look in that direction even more so, because every time I look at these texts and put it all together, and I'm just trying to think about it in a very material way, this idea of the discarnate entities or this other strange component keeps poking up. And so I feel the need to look at it a little more closely. And so that's where I'm at now. I'm still researching, and that's the direction that I'm looking at, because it seems to me that there's just more there that needs to be addressed separately.
Fantastic. The book is The Anunnaki Connection, Sumerian Gods, Alien DNA, and the Fate of Humanity. My guest has been Dr. Heather Lynn. Heather, this is a real fun read, and people can get this on, I think they can get it on Amazon, right?
Yes, it's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, indie bookstores. Be sure to help them out right now in everyone's time of need, and it's on audiobook as well. So
yeah. I was going to say, we'll probably see you on some conference, but right now, who knows what's going on with conferences? Any gatherings,
I know,
forget
everything's
it.
been weird. I know. It'll give me time to write a little bit more. So
it is a good chance to write, but we don't know how long this social distancing is going to be carried on. So, but hey, listen, thank you for joining me, and much success on this book. It's really opened my eyes to so many other possibilities. And I want to ask you, and I want to thank you for clarifying your belief that the amateur research investigator has a place as well as the academic researcher when it comes to presenting information. Because I think, and you talk about this, I think that the academic side of things tends to shoot down those who are not credentialed, and they feel, or a body of governors feels, that are not credible.
Oh, absolutely. It's so important that we all work together and, look at these things credentials, it's a blessing and a curse. I think a lot of times it goes to people's heads, and it's not fair, and it's a form of elitism that I think is very unhelpful.
Right. I mean, you could write a whole book on that. Just from the chapter that I read,
know.
you could write a whole book on. I mean, but look at through history, some of that weren't archaeologists that found great, ruins and did research and found evidence that later became, supporting our history. So
Great. Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same with astronomers too. And it seems, though, sometimes that the amateur astronomers, as they're called, have done so much to discover different comets and different things. And it seems, though, to me that the mainstream astronomers are more apt to give the amateur astronomers credit and accolades, whereas in archaeology, this idea of armchair historian or amateur archaeologist is looked at in a very negative way, which I think is a real shame.
Yeah, I have to say the one chapter that I read that you brought out, your mentor, who you give accolades to, is Michael Cremo, who wrote Forbidden Archaeology, and how the mainstream put him on a list of the pseudo archaeologists to research as a young archaeological student. I couldn't believe that. And it's like, okay, you have to write why you debunk him,
before you even know what you're doing. I think that's a terrible, terrible disservice. So that's exactly what it was. So, well,
amazing.
Hopefully we can break barriers with shows like yours and books like mine.
Yeah, definitely. Heather, thank you very much, and much success on this book, and we'll look forward to hearing from you again.
Thanks so much for having me, Cliff. It's been a great pleasure.